Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to a very good, very intense flip that we're about to record together that is going to be all about imperialism, right? So I love the conversation that we had last class right before y'all left for retreat and stuff like that about imperialism. We alluded to a lot of content that day, right? We had really, really engaging conversations. I know Jordan was like really, really vibing with the whole like British Museum and artifacts conversation that we were having, which is a really good conversation to have, especially leading into the stuff that we're about to be talking about. We had a lot of really, really good questions. We talked about, I know we like really, really started to understand better about the effects of automatic weaponry and advancements in weaponry. I know like Rufino was like really understanding that, talking about like automatic versus semi-automatic weapons, and then of course the quinine medicine and stuff like that. That's going to give these Europeans the ability to go out there and press their advancement. Like that's not the word we're looking for. Give these Europeans the ability to go out there and take and steal land that they don't belong, and take and steal resources that don't belong to them, and then also impugn their authority over people that they believed were underdeveloped, right? So like now, the biggest thing about it though is we left off in class talking about our first key example. We were going to be getting into the opening, quote unquote, of Asia, right? Of course, like we're not talking about, when we did originally talk about like opening, how screwed up a word that was. They were closed because like they wanted to be and you should have just left them alone, right? So, but the big thing about it though is we're mainly talking about Britain and its effects on China. So to understand this entire thing, really, really big thing going into it, you got to understand that in the 1790s, the British are broke as a joke, right? They have no money. The Industrial Revolution is just beginning to bubble up, right? They're heavily in debt. They are also, luckily for them, being able to stay uninvolved in the French Revolutionary crisis that's going on in the continent. Now, couple the ideas of industrial movement with economic gain. So the British are slowly beginning to dig themselves out of this massive amount of debt due to the industrial and industrious revolutionary movements, post-agricultural revolutionary movement of the 1660s. Why could I spit that out so quickly? Now, anyway, it's like I rehearsed this. Now, the big thing, though, is that the 1790s Britain is very, very broke, right? Whereas China is very, very not. All right, so China was actually economically extremely prosperous, right? They were under the control of this thing known as the Qing dynasty, which had been ruling over China. One family had been ruling over the China known as the Celestial Kingdom for over 200 years, right? They practiced something called economic isolationism, right? So they refused to buy British goods, right? The British looked upon China as being like, oh, they have things we want. We have industrialized goods. We have cheap cotton textiles. We have wool textiles. We have all these things. Maybe the Chinese will want to buy these things from us, and then we can use their good economy to dig us out of our bad economy. Well, the problem is that the Chinese don't want your garbage trinkets, Great Britain. They don't want cheap cotton textiles. They have silk. They don't want your manufactured porcelain. They have Chinese porcelain. And they also don't want anything else you're selling because they have a lot of economic goods that make a bunch of money. One of the biggest ones including there is tea, right? And the only way that British people were allowed to trade anyway was in one city known as Canton, right? So Canton is on the banks of a very, very large waterway in China and is right near the island of Hong Kong, right? So the British look upon China and they're like, man, not only are they making more money than we are, they're refusing to buy any of our products, and also we are still losing money because they have something we desperately want, tea, right? By this point in history, the 1800s, the British are heavily addicted to tea. 10% of the average annual household income was being directed towards the purchase of tea, right? So that is insanely high. Tea was very expensive coming from China. So the biggest thing the Brits kept going up to the Chinese was saying, well, allow us to go further into China. Allow us to try and sell these goods there. And the Chinese are like, no, because we don't want your stuff here corrupting our people, right? And they had every right to do that. The Chinese were very smart in doing this, right? So the British decided to try and find one good that maybe the Chinese would want in exchange for their tea so they could like actually sell it back in Britain at a cheaper cost. And so what they do is they begin to trade opium for tea. Now, I don't know if you know this, but opium is the same stuff that makes heroin, all right? It makes oxycodone. It makes opium-based or opioid-based painkillers in the United States. This stuff is heavily illegal here, and it was extremely illegal in closed, economically isolated Qing dynasty China, right? They knew that if opium was allowed to circulate through its streets, that economic productivity would massively go down, and they were trying to protect their people because the Chinese had outlawed opium for quite some time, right? The British started growing opium, though, legally in India, right? They start growing it in India, processing it into opium, and the opium would then be smoked by a lot of people, which became a very, very direct way to get a sensation of being lucid, it's a depressant, and getting them very, very addicted to this drug, right? So the idea that the British are going to start trading illegally drugs to Chinese merchants in exchange for their tea, that is going to make this tea borderline cost-free because they're growing this opium for so cheap in India, right? And they're going to go back to England and sell it for a massive profit. Now, the problem is that this is stupid illegal in China. Really, Great Britain, you decided to give drugs to a society because they didn't want to buy your garbage, all right? So now going forward, though, you really shouldn't do this because it's illegal in China, but the Brits are going to do it anyway, right? So they're going to start trading this opium to Chinese merchants illegally. The opium is going to begin to get smuggled in through the ports of Canton. They're going to start bribing Cantonese officials, and they're going to start trying to infiltrate the Chinese society using drug trade, right? Now, the Chinese tried to stop this. The Dowager Emperor actually deliberately tried to stop this by appointing a guy that he knew named Liu Zhuzong. All right, so now this Chinese diplomat and general tried to stop the sale of opium by dumping it into the sea, seizing it at ports, destroying it on beaches, and a lot of different things like that. He also deliberately tried to send a letter to Queen Victoria telling him that your EIC, your East India Company, is selling drugs to our people deliberately, aggressively. So do us a favor and please stop, right? That letter never made it to Queen Victoria, right? And in the process of him writing that letter, Chinese officials then seized 21,000 chests of opium at the ports of Canton, right? 21,000 chests. They then took those chests of opium, burned them, and sank them to the bottom of the Chinese Bay, right? So, or not the Chinese Bay, but the ports at Canton, right? So the Brits, the EIC particularly, because they're deliberately keeping this letter away from Queen Victoria, are then going to demand compensation for their illegal drugs. I don't know if I can hammer this home very much harder. The British sold things illegally to a population of people to get them addicted to drugs so they could have tea for cheaper. And then when these people and their local government decide to seize these drugs and destroy them to prevent the destruction of lives and the destruction of their economy and the destruction of families within their country, they are then going to destroy them, and the Brits demand money for their lost drugs. This would be like a drug cartel demanding the American government compensation for destroyed drugs. This is bananas, right? And the fact that they demanded compensation and the Chinese refused, this is going to lead to the very first Opium War. And the very first Opium War broke out in 1839. The British, though, are going to use the products of their Industrial Revolution to totally overwhelm the Chinese forces, even though they were outnumbered 50,000 Chinese soldiers to 6,000 British soldiers. And why were they able to do this? A lot of it has to do with the fact that the British Army was heavily trained. Many of them were veterans of other foreign wars, including Crimean War, 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, other uprisings that they had suppressed in places like India, right? They were heavily trained, had heavily units, and they also had better technology. Most of the Chinese soldiers were still using spears, swords, and bows and arrows, right? So, whereas the British had fully functioning, albeit they were not the best guns on the planet, they're still muskets, and it still takes them a long time to load them, but they also had cannons, right? Mobile artillery, and they also had steam-powered vessels. The biggest one and the most popular one was known as the HMS Nemesis, right? Her Majesty's Service Nemesis, or Her Majesty's Ship the Nemesis. This thing was actually powered completely by steam and had an iron hull. And as you can see in this thing, this right here is a Chinese ship with a wooden hull that it is just deliberately destroyed, right? So the British are going to heavily overwhelm the Chinese, and they're going to win this first Opium War, and then they're going to demand that the Chinese pay them money for that original shipment, and they're going to be forced to open up trade to the British, right? So China was now, since it was closed early on, is going to be forcefully opened to British trade, right? And this is going to include the legalization of opium. This is bananas. This is absolutely insane. This is a European country imposing its will and its drug trade on another group of people that don't want it, right? So, and the Chinese were forced to sign this very first of things known as unequal treaties because it heavily advantaged the British and heavily disadvantaged the Chinese, right? The Chinese then and the Qing Chinese are going to have to pay a huge amount, millions of dollars in indemnities to the British government, and British traders were not going to be subject to Chinese laws. So basically, you just created a system where the British are going to be legally allowed to sell drugs inside of a country, and they're also going to be allowed to sell whatever they want inside of this, like these ports that were previously closed to them. And then also, not to mention the fact that if they were to do something wrong, Chinese law cannot punish them, right? This is going to start a period of time known as the Century of Humiliation for the Chinese, right? Because it's going to be the very first of a series of unequal treaties. Because, of course, now that the rest of Europe has seen the British heavily favor themselves and become economically advantaged inside of, like, the Qing Chinese Empire, then here comes America and France. Ooh. Yeah, I hate to break it to y'all, but we were also heavily involved in this Century of Humiliation against Asiatic empires, right? The Americans and French are going to then impress their own versions of unequal treaties on the Qing, threatening military action, right? The Qing were also fighting internal rebellions, so they did not have the ability to fight off the Americans and the French as well at the exact same time. One of the biggest rebellions that was going on inside of their borders was known as the Taiping Rebellion, where a very, very large group of converted Chinese Christians were trying to rebel against the Dowager Emperor and trying to destroy their entire Qing dynasty from the inside. The Taiping Rebellion would lead to the death of some estimates as 20 million Chinese people, right? At the hands of other Chinese people because they're trying to suppress a revolt and then also trying to fight off foreign invaders, right? So the refusal to trade with the Brits later on. So these treaties were signed. Here come the Americans, here come the French, right? They're now involved, piggybacking off of the British opening of China, right? The Canton system was going to be thrown out the window, right? Now that they're going to be allowed to trade at several different ports, okay? Also, other really, really important thing, the island of Hong Kong was going to be forced to be ceded to the British as well, right? An interesting fact, if you did not know this already, Hong Kong remained a British what's the word I'm looking for? A British holding or a British-owned thing all the way up until the 1990s, right? So the refusal, though, to continue to trade with the British because other cities in China are going to be like, no, we don't want to trade with you. We still want to keep this closed. We don't want your crap, right? So, and they're going to refuse to do this also because of this arsenic bread situation. So there was a very large Chinese bakery that actually baked a huge amount of bread that the British would buy and then ship to Europe, right? And in the process of shipping this bread to Europe, there was a bunch of families in Europe, especially in Great Britain, that actually succumbed to arsenic poisoning. And they found out later on that apparently the arsenic may or may not have been deliberately put into the bread by the bakers in China trying to attack the people of Great Britain in their actual homes, right? Now, I kind of find this to be like, hey, you got us, we're going to get you back because, you know, you sold drugs to our people, no big deal. And so this is going to lead to the outbreak of the Second Opium War, right? And then the Second Opium War is going to last from 1856 to 1860, and a coalition of forces are going to unite together to try and destroy the Qing forces in the Second Opium War, right? And coalition of forces, I mean, not just the British this time, but the French, the Americans, the Russians, even also the Germans as well, right? So, well, not the Germans completely because they weren't actually heavily, like, they weren't fully formed yet, but some Prussian forces were there. So, and yes, I'm not joking, Napoleon III was directly involved in this and directly called for the invasion of China a second time in the Second Opium War, just because, yet again, they did not want to allow drugs to be sold in their country, right? So the Qing power is going to be destroyed after this, and the Europeans are going to be destroying this idea of the celestial kingdom, right? That once glorious Chinese culture that existed before the 1830s, before the first Opium War, the one that actually profited heavily off of their own internal economics, the ones that made goods that the rest of the world wanted, the place that was doing so well and doing so prosperous, have pretty much been completely destroyed, first by the British and then by the rest of the world, the developed world, right? And so after this, and after the suppression of a revolt that we will talk about in the next flip, known as the Boxer Rebellion, there is going to be the establishment of this thing known as spheres of influence, where basically the rest of the developed world would create areas that their country would control and trade inside of, right? So here, for example, was the Russian sphere of influence that would later be taken by the Japanese. As we know, the fighting over this led to the Russo-Japanese War, right? Japanese would actually take over Korea. We'll talk about why the Japanese are actually involved in this entire thing in a minute. The British are going to take over this entire system on the Yangtze River, and then they're also going to take over Canton and Hong Kong, and then the Japanese are going to take over Taiwan. The French are then going to come in as well and take over this entire area known as now modern-day Vietnam and can turn it into what's known as French Indochina, right? So this entire thing is absolutely wild. And the sad part is, it's not the first nor the last time it was going to happen, right? Another massive example of opening an Asian economy was that of Japan, right? And this is, we're going to jump back in time to the 1850s, okay? So another example of this early economic isolationism was Japan. Japan was completely economically isolated and was illegal for foreigners to trade inside of their country, right? Until the arrival of a U.S. diplomat, right? U.S. Admiral Matthew Perry. No, not Matthew Perry from Friends, but Matthew Perry and U.S. Admiral showed up and threatened the Japanese and saying, you have 1 year to open this country to American traders, or else I am going to bring our gunboat and our giant American steam-powered armada, bring it back in 1860, and we're going to try to use it to destroy you, right? So this is going to lead to a massive set of rebellions inside of Japan over the argument of not wanting to allow Western traders in because they had seen what had happened in China, right? So this is going to lead to this thing known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is going to see the appointment of a very young emperor, oftentimes called the Boy Emperor, right? And he is going to go then on a tirade of modernizing Japan. And from 1868 to 1931, following the gunboat diplomacy issued by Matthew Perry, you're going to see a massive amount of industrialization because Japan was forced with a choice. Do we get taken over like the Qing Chinese did, or do we actually modernize and become an imperial colony of our own? And they chose the modernization idea. They contracted through American, German, English, Russian, and other different figureheads of Europe, took their ideas and their modernization ideas and modernized themselves much like a Western European country. And this, of course, is going to come to a figurehead when they try to take over Chinese Manchuria and to get involved in this Opium War crisis. And they take that from the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War, right? And a big thing about this Russo-Japanese War that we haven't talked about yet, we will actually come back and talk about it a little bit later when we get closer to Russia and closer to the 1917 revolution that they're going to have and a lot of the really, really chaotic things that led up to that, right? Their second wave of industrialization, how that's going to lead to this thing called the Trans-Siberian Railway. Go ahead and store that in the back of your mind. And also we're going to talk about Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, father of Anastasia's really, really poor handling of a war that ends up breaking out with Japan after they had already been industrialized, right? So that is a big thing that we're going to end up going into a little bit later, but just keep that on the back burner in your mind. But another big thing that we need to talk about in this flip to understand it perfectly well is the fact that there is going to be a massive, what is known as Scramble for Africa, right? So this is going to be a map of Africa in 1880, as you can see right there. This is a really good understanding of the beginnings of new imperialism and its heavy, heavy effects on the continent of Africa. By 1880, all of the gray right here was completely unimperialized, right? So all this stuff that's in gray right there is stuff that is not owned or being being forced onto by a European power. And so this stuff over here on the right side is Africa in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. So as you can see, there are only 2 countries in the entirety of the continent of Africa by 1914 that have not been colonized and imperialized by the Europeans in the search for resources like diamonds, gold, like rubber, as well as petroleum. So those 2 nations that were the only ones that weren't imperialized were Liberia and Ethiopia. And we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on. Now, getting into it, though, you got to understand that Europeans wanted to begin to explore the uncharted areas of Africa. And this had actually started in about the 1870s. Now, uncharted to Europeans means areas that they have never actually made maps of. They've never found the source of rivers before. And a big thing is going to happen, a big huge trend where these European explorers are going to begin to push their ways into the uncharted regions of Africa. One famous one was Roger Livingston, who actually got lost in Africa for quite some time. And then another one was named Henry Morton Stanley in 1876, who is one of the biggest pieces of garbage that I have ever studied in my entire life. Henry Morton Stanley, literally, apparently, on his journeys through Africa, would lead to the death of hundreds and hundreds, if not almost 1,000 of these people called porters, who were these people that actually carried his goods for him while he sat and rode on an elephant while they're charting the untold regions of Africa. And apparently Henry Morton Stanley, all he wanted to do is find the source of the Congo, where the Congo River came through and where it actually started and began. Ends up finding out that it actually is several different rivers that combined up in the further regions of what is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But Henry Morton Stanley also was the guy that found Roger Livingston, or excuse me, not Roger Livingston, David Livingston. Roger Livingston, somebody completely different. Now, so the big thing about David Livingston, though, he finds him in Africa and helps save him, even though David Livingston ends up dying about like 3 years later. But the interior that these two people people like these two are gonna discover is that the interior is plentiful with raw materials that Europeans want to use to actually industrialize, make into factories. Well, not make the materials into factories, but use them in factories and create new finished products that are gonna make them a ton of money. So looking at this, they had very little trouble taking over any territory they wanted due to their massive technological advantages and also due to their ability to basically just absolutely steal land away from African tribes. We talked about this in class the other day when we talked about how they were handing like tribal chiefs documents that said on there that they would have to give up all their land, and most of these chiefs couldn't even read or write. I know that when we had that conversation, like Gode kind of had like an aha moment right there for a hot sec, right? So going into it though, they had very little trouble taking whatever they wanted, right? Their huge technological advantages demonstrated by guys like these 2 explorers are going to show them that now with quinine medicine, now with advanced weaponry, and now with steam-powered transportation, they're going to be able to go in and take just about whatever they want. Now, the discovery of raw materials such as copper, gold, rubber, ivory, diamonds, palm oil, etc. are going to cause a massive race for this territory. This race was known as the Scramble for Africa. So do me a favor and write Scramble for Africa. And what's going to end up happening is all of these Europeans are going to start trying to take over African territory to make and accomplish that map right there on the right? So looking at this map, that right there is the Scramble for Africa. These European powers showing up as fast as they possibly can, trying to use their military influence and their technology to go in and take over all this uncharted territory. Now, in the 1884, there's going to be a meeting in Berlin to civilly slice up the entire continent of Africa and take and steal these things from the people that had lived there for decades and generations and centuries. Now, in this meeting in 1884, it was led by Otto von Bismarck. So this is one of the more disgusting things Otto von Bismarck did. And they actually divided up completely the continental territory of Africa and decided what country was going to get what area and at what cost and what they were actually going to do about border disputes and things like that to avoid war. So in 1884, the entirety of the continent of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, will end up going to different European powers, all for the advancement of different items and for the stealing of these different things. But the major effects of imperialism in African communities are going to be forced Christian conversion. Large amounts of African resistance are going to actually show up. There was one charted event where 5,000 Africans went up against 50 British people with 4 Maxim guns. And the big thing about it, when this happens, is that this African resistance, this 5,000 men, they were actually from southern Africa, and a lot of it has to do with the Dutch Boers and things like that, but they actually tried to destroy this group of 50 British officers and 4 Maxim guns. And those 5,000 Africans were completely slaughtered by those 4 Maxim guns. And then on top of everything else, Europeans started coming up, and British people started coming up with a phrase that demonstrated how awesome they were and how no one could stop them in Africa. And they had a poem that said, how'd it go? So I just jumped over real quick and came back so I could go over that poem. A famous saying and poem began to go around Britain after events like these that said, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. And that is absolutely disgusting to basically mock, play around, and jeer about the fact that you have the ability to slaughter entire communities and cultures. It's very unsettling. It's right there, and I had it on the screen the entire time. So yes, whatever happens, we've got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Fighting also between Europeans over African lands are going to break out. You're going to see the Boer Wars that are going to break out. The Fashoda Crisis is going to break out, where these different European powers are going to begin demanding different areas because of the mineral-rich resources. For example, the Boer Wars all broke out because of diamonds and gold that was discovered in South Africa, and the war was between Dutch-descendant Boers and then also British people. So Europeans came in and fought over land that should have never been theirs in the first place, okay? So going forward as well, enforcement and dissemination of racist ideology is going to transpire. And then last but not least, of course, last but very important, massive amounts of genocide. And we're actually going to pick up on this point when we get back to class, and we're going to talk about the Belgian conquest of the Congo, and we're going to talk about the 10 million deaths that are believed to have occurred in Africa, all for rubber and ivory. So we'll talk about that stuff a little bit more when I see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. I'll talk to y'all soon.